Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
The Athletic.
What's going on with Red Bull's bib adjuster, and have they done anything illegal? Why is Mercedes still confused, and what does balance really mean when it comes to a Formula 1 car? Gary has all the answers and takes on a question from NASA. Welcome back to the Race F1 Tech Show, which we're squeezing in between the first and second races of the triple header after what was a very interesting weekend technically in Austin. I'm Edd Straw, but far more significantly, I'm joined by Gary Anderson. So welcome back, Gary. We've got Mexico next. That's a track that has some very fond memories for you, particularly the first Jordan year.
It certainly does, Ed, yes. First Jordan year, 1991, it was quite a strange season because we had quite a few reliability problems at the beginning of the year, but we were showing speed. Then in Montreal we got some points, which was obviously very important. And in Mexico, it was the first time that I think, standing on the pit wall there with the cars coming through the last corner, which was a flat-out right-hander, banked right-hander. It was the first time that, I sort of clicked onto the fact, actually, we're actually going racing here. Because all the other circuits, it's a bit tame on the pit wall. You don't really sort of feel the car, or you don't really see the speed. And that was the first time that you really sort of picked up the fact this car's cornering here at very high speed. There's a Williams and a McLaren and a Ferrari or whatever going around, and we were there with them. So, yeah, ended up fourth. Ran out of fuel in the last lap, which is a bit disappointing. But, it was one of those sort of situations where a few more points. At Jordan, we always tried to build an efficient car because we didn't ever believe we'd have as good an engine as anybody else. So there's no point in piling on inefficient downforce. And again, in Mexico, because of the altitude, that paid dividends. So it's about what you cut your cloth to suit what you can do. As I say, we always built an efficient car to try and make up for the lack of horsepower that we probably have from customer engines as such.
Yeah, and certainly it's always been a great venue. Obviously, the track's changed a little bit since those days, but yeah, still a very popular race. As always, we'll start off with you having a free choice of technical topics to talk about. So what are you going to go for, Gary? I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to be about a team we speak about a lot on this podcast, given their struggles, the silver one. Yeah,
it is a bit of a silver one, really. Mercedes, I don't speak about them negatively because obviously it's very tough. So I do accept to a certain level that Formula 1 currently with the ground effect cars, it's not easy to understand everything that goes on. But, they've arrived this season with a couple of decent-sized upgrades. And in reality, the one that came earlier in the year, they had to step backwards on it. And now this one was a new floor and revised front wing, revised engine cover, beam wing, lots and lots of changes, and they say this is their last sort of upgrade for this season. If it is, they've really got to get on top of it because it didn't look as though the car was a step forward, I suppose you might call it, in Austin. I mean, the Friday practice session, they were quick. Both cars were quick, and it seemed to be, here we go, Mercedes are back in the game. But then, like quite a few other races over the last couple of years, they slid backwards very quickly. And that normally is something that basically you end up with, as you're optimizing the setup, you're digging a bigger hole for yourself because you've got some sort of an inherent aerodynamic problem. As I say, every time they go for a floor development, underfloor development or diffuser development or floor edge development, there always seems to be a question mark over whether it actually functions or not. In one session it's good, one session it's not so good. And we saw that over the whole Austin weekend. So I think what they've sort of got themselves into is this chasing downforce philosophy. And it's one of these things that you cannot simulate a ground effect car in the wind tunnel or in CFD because you can't, as we see, the cars need to run very, very close to the ground. maximum benefit is when you can get them right down into the ground. But you can't do that in the wind tunnel, and you really can't do it CFD either, because the ground's a moving component, and obviously in the wind tunnel, if you drop the model into the ground, you will end up with a disaster, because the model head down the wind tunnel on top of the belt. So you have to keep it away to a certain extent, and it's that last few millimetres that is critical to a ground effect car. And again, because it's that last few millimetres, it's also very critical to track temperature and ambient temperature, because the change on that is huge. For 5 degrees, let's say, of track or ambient, the change in those last few little millimetres, and the airflow separation problems. We used to always work a bit on the front wing, and because it was, in the old days, the front wing was lower to the ground, so it was in ground effect as such most of the time. And basically, if you could pick up in the wind tunnel that you were having airflow separation problems in the front wing, albeit fairly small, you would go to a track like Barcelona, let's say, and you'd be testing in the winter, and that airflow separation problem would correlate quite well. You go back for the Grand Prix when everything's a bit hotter, in May or whatever it be, everything's gone up by a few degrees, and that airflow separation suddenly becomes, dramatic. And it was the same with the diffuser. If you've got a stall in the diffuser, which is what you try to get because it reduces the drag on the old cars, then, in the cool light of day, it was fine. Morning session, fine. But in the afternoon session, the car would be a nightmare. You just had snap oversteer everywhere. So it's one of those sort of situations. I think you need the gut feel to read between the lines a little bit on how critical the floor you've got is against what could happen if you go somewhere else and the temperatures are changing. Because in the wind tunnel, one of the things you do is try to keep the temperature stable. So you only get one set of numbers at one ambient as such temperature and one belt temperature. So I think, they're definitely... I don't believe Mercedes are on top of that yet, of that feeling, that gut feeling. I mean, they can achieve anything, but just chasing downforce is not the way that a ground effect car will get better.
It's a very interesting battle they've had, because they've made good progress with the car. Obviously, they did win those 3 races earlier this year. Circumstances played into that, and they weren't like dominant, disappearing, but there was a clear step. What seems interesting is budging that just fundamental problem they've always had of the car being erratic and swinging from track to track, session to session. They should have been on pole for the sprint. But then Saturday things were terrible, and the team basically admitted they thought on Friday, this is looking really good, and then it all fell apart. So it's really interesting, because it seems that it's less that the upgrades they bring are creating new problems. It's more that there just seems to be this stubborn problem at the heart of it that they can't get round. So it's not that the upgrade necessarily is wrong. It's part of the lineage of the DNA of a car that's just got something that just isn't quite right, which is why obviously you were talking about the methodologies, etc. But how frustrating will it be when you're in that scenario? Because they'll know they're struggling with it. They'll know they don't know the answer. And how difficult is it to try and get to the bottom of it when you've been studying this for years and they've probably looked at everything constantly? What do you do when you feel like you've done everything and you're still having this problem? Well,
it's one of these situations. The first thing you got to do is admit to yourself that you got this problem. And I don't know how many people could have been in pole position for the sprint race or even qualifying in Austin, because I think everybody would say they could have been if. And that F's the big word. As I always say, F is F1 backwards. But it's one of these sort of situations where you've got to look at why, because only they know how many points of downforce, that they call it, or I call it just simple kilograms of downforce, or the efficiency levels they've brought to the car for Austin. And they only they know where that's come from. As I say, the changes I've seen on the car, I would question the work on the front corner of the floor harder, because that obviously works as a package completely with the complete underfloor. The sort of better you scavenge that front corner of the floor, the better opportunity the diffuser has to work with the flow that's coming in the middle of the car, or the inside the inside 2 splitters at the leading edge of the floor, because that's what it works on, and you're trying to pull that other flow out as much as you can with the curved splitters that's underneath the floor. But those curved splitters, because you got a low pressure area behind them, those curved splitters have spillage across the bottom edge of them where they're closest to the ground. And that spillage sets up vortices, which re-energizes the flow that's in the actual underfloor section of the floor and into the diffuser. And that's the area I think that's wrong. Of the pictures I've seen of the Mercedes underfloor splitters, I would say that they're not great vortex shedders. They're quite, well, they're long, like everybody is, but they're sort of straight. They're long, quite straight, then curved. And what you need to do to get the vortex to shed off that part quite consistently is to keep loading it up so you get the spillage all the way along that lower edge. And I'm not sure that happens on the Mercedes as well as it should do. So I think, as you say, they don't keep putting developments on it to go worse. But if you've got an inherent philosophy or understanding of something and you keep changing to make it better, then that problem just stays with you. It might even get a little bit worse on some occasions. It might get a fraction better. But unless you attack that basic inherent sort of design concept, then you'll always have it with you to some degree. And I'm not sure that Mercedes are quite on top of what that philosophy, that design philosophy should be. Here's me sitting back here saying this sort of thing, and they've got probably 200 people working on trying to sort that problem out, and I'm sitting here saying what I think. But sometimes it's better to step back a little bit and have a look at stuff and think about it a little bit more, rather than just being, caught up in the everyday life of battle.
No, exactly, and it's very important they tackle this, because otherwise they're going to have a car next year that could be very quick, but only sporadically, and that means they'll win a few races, but they're not going to fight for a championship, which is obviously where they want to be. And before we move on to our main topic, I think track limits you were getting excited about with some justification, not perhaps in a good way, from Austin. No, not strictly a technical thing, although there could be technical solutions to it, but it's quite frustrating viewing.
Yeah, it is frustrating to see track limits abused. I mean, obviously if a car is on its own, it's in qualifying, let's say, it's going around and it goes outside of the white line. It seems to be now that's fairly well in control. It's still down to cameras and judgment, as opposed to some type of sensor, which would be a much better way of doing it. Or, as some people are saying, look, 2 meters away from that white line, dig a trench and fill it with gravel, or put grass in it, or whatever. Limit the track itself by just allowing a 2 meter car to go 2 meters off that line without causing any grief. Now, we see circuits where gravel works quite well, but you do see circuits where that gravel gets picked up and spat back onto the track, so it causes other grief. But, so as I say, a simple thing with one car and track limits, that's under control to a certain level, and I think the drivers and the teams now fairly well accept that what the FIA see, they will police. I think they should police it for every corner, not just selective corners, but that's another story. But then we get into the problems we had in Austin, where it's a case of pushing another driver off the track, or another driver going off the track. And in Lando Norris's case against Max Verstappen, it was obviously up the front of the race, so it got a lot of TV coverage. But again, there's this thing about who's the leading car, who's the car that's in front at the time, and who's the challenging cars, and that needs to be sorted out. I mean, what I see basically is you could steam up a straight. A car on the inside could, for the next corner, could, brake at the normal point, whatever. But the guy on the outside could arrive with all four wheels smoking, and be ahead at the entry of the corner, be ahead and on the outside. So suddenly he becomes the leading car, and the other car becomes the offending car or the attacking car, and that's wrong. I think, at any point in the corner, the most difficult part is where the apex is. So whether you're on the inside or the outside, whether you got all four wheels locked up or whatever, that's the point where you should decide if you're the leading car or the attacking car. And all you got to do, very, very simple, is put a white line across the track between the two white lines. At an angle that is generally what you think is the apex of the corner. And that's the point that a camera could be pointing at. That's the point that you say, yep, X was ahead at that point. because that's the part of the track you have to do. Yeah, you have to be within the 2 white lines when you're there at that point at the apex, and you have to be ahead. Now, what you could say is Matt's could have ran wide there and pushed Norris off earlier, so he was outside of the white line at that point. But that's highly unlikely, because at that point in time the car would be at a very strange angle, and again Verstappen would be going off as well. And I think that, at that point in time, that sort of should highlight who, if you've overtaken off the track, if you're ahead at that point in time, then you are the lead car. So if you go off the track after that, you haven't actually overtaken off the track, you've overtaken before it. It's all a very fine line, but we need more information, because at the minute there isn't enough information, not for me, but for the stewards. There is a way, I think, where you could have it visually available to the stewards and to Joe Public, but also be there for the driver. It wouldn't be this thing, if I can get my nose ahead just by braking that little bit too late, then suddenly I become the lead car. And that's wrong. It needs to be at a certain point, and that point needs to be the apex.
I like the fact that your high-tech solution is a tin of paint. Sometimes the simple answers are the best. Well,
it's going across the track there. You're talking about a 4-inch wide line or something. It's not nothing dramatic. It's a tin of, it can be a tin of high grit paint. It's not going to cause any great grief. You'll cross that quite quickly. But there'll be a marker there. That marker might not be in the right place, but it'll be the marker they use. And that marker will be there for the teams, the drivers, and the FIA. And the big thing for me is, then you need to pass responsibility on to the teams. And the teams and the driver is part of the team. The teams and the driver need to make their minds up quickly. They're the people that need to make that decision initially. And I would give them to the next time you pass there to have reacted to that situation. If you've passed a car off track, then you have to let that car pass before you get back to that point. And this 5-second thing where you drive as fast as you can to try and make 5 seconds on the guy that you've just overtaken off track is wrong. That needs to be a bigger penalty. And if you don't do it within that one lap as well, you get a bigger penalty. So it just means there's no way out of this situation. We want to see real racing. We don't want to see banger racing. We don't want to see drivers, battles, fighting on the radio. They're all wrong. Let's go racing and let's have racing, but set the same set of controls criteria for everybody, and make sure that everybody knows what the control criteria is. Put more responsibility on the team and the driver to react to a situation, because everybody can make a mistake, go off the track and pass somebody because the other car was slow. You've got to let them pass. We see it many, many occasions where the driver does let them pass and then has another go at it. We see it in many occasions where the driver lets them pass and can't get past again, but put the responsibility to the team and the driver to react to a situation before the FIA has to step in.
Yeah, and that would solve quite a lot of the drama that surrounds this stuff. Yeah, I think that's going to be a topic that just runs and runs, because it has been a problem for so long. Let's move on to our main topic now, which it couldn't be anything else, could it, given what happened at Austin? It's the controversy about Red Bull's bib adjustment system and whether or not it's been used under parc ferme conditions. The basic details is there's a perfectly legal design on the car, and the fear raised by other teams is that this could allow adjustments to be made surreptitiously under parc ferme, which would be emphatically illegal. There'd be no defence for doing that. FIA's tried to draw a line under it, say, well, there's no evidence that it had been used, and so they can't sort of retrospectively prove everything. They've put a seal on it to make sure there's no insinuations, was the word used, going forward. So there's lots to get into here, Gary. I mean, the starting point, I guess, is why is it so important to have the right setting for that, the bib at the front of the floor? What kind of performance gains are we talking about? And if you could adjust that between qualifying and the race, how big a gain would that be?
It's a big gain. In the old days, 0.5 millimetre front ride height, you could find a 1/10 of a second if you could just get that little bit more downforce out of the car. By lowering the front of the car and raising the rear a little bit, you could change the centre of pressure, you could move it forward. You don't want to be doing that too much with ground effect cars now because you get more leakage at the sides, but it is a mechanism for adjusting the car a little bit. But the bib height is critical because it's the flow over the top of that bib that gets into the diffuser, and you start the low pressure on the lowest part of the car, which is the plank and the bib area, as quickly as possible, because the nearer to the ground you are, the faster the flow through there, the more downforce you'll get out of it. But there's two mechanisms. One is there's a sort of swing arm arrangement that mounts the front of the bib. It's mounted on the chassis. And then there's a spring and damper mechanism, a vertical spring and damper mechanism, a bit like the rear suspension on a motorbike, I suppose, if you wanted to simplify it. And that spring would be preloaded to accept the load test that the FIA put on the bib, which is a vertical load test. It's an upward load test. And you have to pass that, obviously. But then you'll also have a sort of a tie rod stopping it as you put that preload on. You don't want it to go down any further than the sort of being flat, I suppose you might call it. So there'll be a rod inside the car going up through the floor, which you can adjust, which will pull the floor up against that preload. So, for example, if you set the flat floor area and then you increase the preload on the main spring that stops it getting the FIA test for the upward movement, then you may have to increase the load on that tension rod down the inside of it. So it's a balancing that between the tension on that rod in the middle from stopping the floor from being lower than it should be, or the bib from being lower than it should be, or the preload on the spring reacting to the FIA's load test. And you want to balance that as best you can. Now, if you had it all set up nicely and you were to, let's say, be able to adjust something on that rod to allow the floor to be a millimetre lower or half a millimetre lower for qualifying, and then in parc ferme be able to adjust it again to make the floor half a millimetre or maybe a millimetre higher for the race, that would make a massive difference to the plank wear. And so something of that nature has been probably happening. The big question is, do you need tools to do it, or can you do it by hand? Because that's what the FIA stipulate, but they put a seal on it now anyway. What I was proposing looking at in my column that I did on it was the fact that if you could use the aerodynamics to pull the floor down that little bit, because there's low pressure underneath it and there is a sort of turning vane on top of it, you could get it to automatically go down a little bit with the aerodynamic load, which would help the aerodynamics quite significantly. But it still wouldn't go up when the FIA were testing it. So let's say you set it up so it was, half a millimetre higher than what it should be with the preload test that the FIA, with the upward test the FIA do, and then it gets sucked down that extra half a millimetre, which means it's moved a millimetre for qualifying. Then, again, because it's not being pulled down with any force other than aerodynamics, it's not going to wear the plank very much. But I would say it's probably the former, the combination of the preloaded outer spring that stops it being pushed up to the tension rod that stops it from being pulled down that is the questionable device that's there. If there is a questionable device, other teams are complaining about it, but the FIA seem happy enough that it's not there now. As we saw in Austin, the Red Bull didn't do a bad job. They were doing okay there. The Ferraris were very good, but Red Bull in the mix there with McLaren, it was more or less the same. So let's see what happens as the season unfolds over these next couple of races as to what politics achieve by complaining about things.
Well, that's the thing. There's very much a political aspect to this, but it's a strange situation because the focus is on the adjustment mechanism, the actual way you activate the adjustment. So the fact you can adjust that in itself isn't a problem from what people see of the mechanism, but it's the fact that it's supposedly easily accessible in the cockpit. Although, as Zach Brown said, he doesn't think the driver could adjust it, so it requires someone else. So it's this idea that you could do a surreptitious adjustment. Now, the designs for all this are that they're what's called open source components. So that means that they're parts that are necessary but are not considered to be important to competition. So basically, rather than creating spec parts, the FIA said, okay, well, you can design what you want within the rules of that, but you have to upload your design onto an open source server, which all the other teams have access to, so others can take your design should they want to. So if you want to invest in doing that, you can, but effectively it's for everyone. So that's where it's been spotted from. So it's a really interesting thing, because that obviously other teams have seen this and raised questions. And the kind of evidence is based on the fact it could happen. Yeah. So it's a really odd situation.
Yeah, well, let's put it a slightly different way, I suppose. You've got this spring mechanism that the FIA put a force against under the front bib of the car to push it up, and it has to withstand a certain load. And you can adjust the preload in that. So, let's say the load's, 50 kilograms just out of the blue. You'd adjust that preload so that at 50.5 kilograms, the preload would break and the floor could go up. Because that means that if you hit a big curb, you don't destroy the chassis. That's what the mechanism's there for, and that's why the FIA put it onto the listed components. So it's one of those things where everybody has a solution more or less the same. This little swing arm and this damper spring unit. But then you have to react that the other way. And let's say you had just a nice little piece of, 6mm threaded bar that was fastened to that front floor bib, that front floor skid, went up through the front of the chassis and at the driver's foot area below his legs type thing. Now, that you would be reacting that load, that preload, or that other spring. So that spring's, the big spring is pushing the floor down, and that little rod's holding the floor up. So you set the two of them. Now, when you hit the floor on the ground over a curb, that big spring will compress, and that rod will slip upwards out of the way, allowing the floor to move up a little bit. So let's say on that rod that you had inside the monocoque, you have a nut. You need a spanner to adjust, to pull the floor up or down, to let the floor up or down. You tighten up a little bit if you want to pull the floor up. You release it a little bit if you want to pull the floor down, or if you want to let the floor go down. Because the other main spring that's around the outside will be, as I say, reacting that on that floor. That's okay. You need a tool to do that. But let's say it was what we call a wing nut. Yeah, it's on that rod. So the driver could, the mechanic could just put his hand down in there, just dust down and around the pedals for the driver, and put a couple of turns on that wing nut by hand. So that's the area I think that could be coming into question. The mechanism of the spring, the damper, the swing arm that mounts the floor and all that, yeah, that's on the server as standard equipment as such that everybody can copy if they want. But one little thing, that hexagon nut that's on there to a wing nut, could change the whole usage of that component, completely. And, it doesn't matter. It's not going to go up and down automatically. It's just the fact that one turn on that thread could pull the floor up by a millimetre for the race. One turn off that, loosening that thread could let the floor go down a millimetre for qualifying. So it's the difference in one little component. And I promise you, if you looked at the design that's released by whatever the team is, it doesn't show what the detail of that nut is. It doesn't go into that detail. It's just the functionality of the mechanism that's there. So, yes, we'll have to wait and see, I think, to see what the outcome is in the longer term. It's one of these sort of things where everybody pushes the grey areas to the maximum, and this is obviously somewhere that you can make good gains. But, what I would say again is Red Bull didn't look too bad in Austin. And they were fast through the fast bit, and that's just the way it is. Sometimes, you get trick a bit with these things, and actually you out-trick yourself. So sometimes it's better to have something that's just not trick, allow it to happen, and get the rest of the setup of the car around it optimized, rather than something aerodynamically that's moving or shifting or different corner to corner. And anyway, time will tell. We're not at the end of the season quite yet.
Obviously, in your time as a technical director, you're involved in plenty of these sorts of things. There's always question marks from rivals about what people are doing, etc. There's the process that goes on. So What's it actually like when you're on the inside of this, either as someone who spotted something on another car you think might be outright illegal, or if you've got people casting aspersions about what your car may or may not be doing? How does that whole sort of process work out? And is it just inevitably a consequence of the kind of the paranoia that's there as well in what is such a technical sport, because there's so much scope for this sort of thing? Is that always a thing that's going on, that everyone's convinced everyone else is cheating?
Yes, I mean, I think that's the problem, isn't it? You know, if somebody is successful, then somebody points a finger at them, because everybody is trying 100%. And as far as they're concerned, what they've created is the best in the business. But it's not like that when it comes to the stopwatch. And so, you know, we had the McLaren rear wing flexing, the double DRS as it's called. We've had things all the way through life, you know, somebody optimizing something fairly well, better than somebody else, and the first thing you do is, oh, that's illegal. Yeah, I've been through it. Fingers been pointed at me at times. I've pointed the fingers at other teams at times. But there's usually a reasonable solution to that, and that comes from people moving from team to team, and that's been happening more lately than it had over quite a few years. So there will be this cross contamination of, well, X did this way. Oh, and somebody else will question it and say, are you sure that's legal? Because, so yeah, there's a lot of that going on. And I think, the in inverted commas, the sort of whistleblower, there will be whistleblowers popping up here and there. That's what will control it really, is somebody that will stand up and be counted, as far as saying, this team runs X, and the management of that team saying, well, we don't see that as legal. And then suddenly you start the rumours and, talk on the pit lane as such, and talk with FIA. Because it's, again, if somebody is, cheating, it's a bit like letting one team or one driver off with, track limits, let's say, and the rest of them have to stick with track limits, and you allow one driver not to bother with track limits. So, you can't do that. And it's the same technically. I think you have to draw the line somewhere. But it's whether it's designed to achieve something out of it, or whether it's accidental. That's another big decision that I think, the FIA has to take on the shoulders, because you could really classify everything. You could look at everything and you could see some reason for it not complying. But is it designed not to comply, or is it actually just happening, by accident? Now, you probably find that if what I say about this nut holding up this reaction rod, or if it's a wing nut, you probably find that, through time somebody said, God, it'd be much easier if that was a wing nut. We could just get fiddle with it, rather than having to get a socket and extension and ratchet and all that stuff down in there. But we'll see. I mean, as I say, I don't want to point the finger at anybody. I can't, because I don't know any more than that. Whenever I see these things, I think about, what do I see the advantage to be? Or what would I be looking at to make an advantage out of it? Because that's my challenge in life. Find the grey area, I suppose you might call it, and try and find a better solution to something. And did the team find a better solution to something doing it this way? So, yes, as I say, it's not. I don't think it's all smoke still rising. I think I haven't seen any flames yet, but the smoke's still rising.
But it's such an odd situation, this one, because the mechanism is perfectly legal. All of that can exist. It's a question of whether it's been used when you're not allowed to, and you can apply that to. And all teams have got ways of adjusting, so it's a question of the. So it's a really odd situation, because I would say, I mean, obviously it's not something Red Bull's argue because they say they haven't done it, but it would be hard to imagine there's an argument for doing that is in the grey areas. It would seem to me to be a pretty clear breach, apart from a systematic one. So that's why this thing becomes difficult, because at least if you say got a part you think's illegal, like the sheer design of a part is not legal, you can look at it and it exists. Mm-hmm. But it's a question of when it's been used, which can't be proved. So this is a really unusual scenario, and there's rival teams that are adamant they've used it, but nobody's got the evidence. The mere existence of it, you can raise suspicions, but you can't prove it. Well,
the minute you put in a regulation, say you've got to have tools to adjust something, that's when you sort of potentially start, open up the minefield, because everything in the car could be just up by hand without tools. But, the difference is fine line. And I mean, I think we go back quite a few years ago, we find that Red Bull were questioned about something to do with being able to adjust the front ride height a little bit on the car without tools, because this with tools thing has been around for many years. And I know a little bit about that because the item they had on the car, I happened to sort of create back in the days when it was actually Jaguar. So I'm not taking credit for it at all, but I was going back into the days whenever you could do some stuff and it was easier to do it by hand than it was to get tools in there to do it. So, and that was kept later on, or part of it, or the sort of philosophy was kept later on. So this is the same sort of thing. You know, the regulations say you got to have tools. What is a tool? If I've got a grip like a gorilla, I can turn things, you know, with my hand, and everything can be designed so that you don't need tools to adjust it in reality. So some things would be a bit of a compromise to do that, but you still could do it. And I think, so they need to look closely at the fact of you're not allowed to adjust the car in parc ferme. You're allowed to do things for driver comfort and you're allowed to do things for X, Y, Z. But at the end of the day, there is an FIA a scrutineer standing in the garage looking at you, and you know he should be able to, you know, to have a decent look at it. It needs to be policed better, I suppose, the best way of putting it. But it will, as I say, it will mean that teams will have a bit of a moan about it for a while, because it is quite a decent thing for such a simple thing, I suppose you might say. Quite a decent reaction to lap time from getting a smaller bit of adjustment on the bib.
Yeah, and that's why it's become such a controversy. But of course, yeah, it all comes down to the evidence. I think it's a bit different to, say, the McLaren FlexiWing thing, because that's kind of implicit in the rules, because they've got the bodywork has to be rigid, but there has to be some flexibility just for practicality. So it's kind of what's allowed. So that was never illegal, even though there's been a bit of back and forth, and McLaren have had to slightly change what they're doing. There's that's sort of working in the grey areas, and what's allowable. This one would be a bit more extreme. So that's why it's such a it's a classic F1 dispute. This one, all sort of insinuations. Obviously, the Red Bull can say, no, well, of course we're not doing that. Everyone can adjust stuff. You're not allowed to. We don't do it. Whereas others can say with certainty they think they're doing it. But yeah, it comes down to the proof. That's the big challenge. Rob, as always, we'll round out with some questions from our listeners. And our first one comes up from Connor Craig, and this is from a great source. So have a listen to this question.
Hey guys, my name is Connor Craig. I live in Houston, Texas, and I work as a systems engineer in the human spaceflight program. So we have going on here for NASA. And my question that I have is regarding systems engineering, of course, because here at NASA, we have a lot of milestones. Things move, relatively speaking, at a snail's pace compared to F1. I see F1 as being quite agile in a sense, because F1 is all about converting research insights into parts on the car as soon as possible. And also in terms of the management structure, there's I've heard many times, you know, there's one person on the top that makes these decisions. The committee approach doesn't. So thank you so much for doing this, guys. Bye. When I think of the F1 systems engineering approach or management structure, even I think more of Mission Control Center that we have here in Houston, because if you think about that, you have all these subject matter experts on consoles, and it's a very time sensitive problem where you diagnose a problem and then you kind of feed it up the ladder to one person that ultimately makes a decision, which here at NASA would be the flight director. So I was wondering, Gary, with your experience, how does the systems engineering approach work in F1? Because for NASA, we have, it's called a systems engineering engine, and it looks like a V. So if you could give any insight, that would be really amazing. Thank you guys so much for the fantastic podcast. It's always a highlight of my day when I see that there's a new one. So thank you so much for doing this, guys. Bye.
Well, a great question there, Gary. I'm very excited to have somebody from NASA writing in. I'm very, very interested in that side of things. So that this is a great thing that shows that there's interest in the world of F1 from that sort of world. Even though there's plenty of differences, there's also some similarities.
Well, I'm very excited to have someone from NASA ask me a question. And Connor, I hope you have a great future. It's obviously a very disciplined responsibility, I think you have, no matter what part you play in it, because, when those things take off, you want to make sure they come back again or get to where they're going to go to, because it's not like a racing car going around a track. But during the question, there's two or three things really, I suppose we should say, is that, yes, Formula One is very reactive. Whatever you consider this year, there's 52 weeks in the year and we've got 24 races. So that's almost, you get judged almost every 2 weeks. Whereas for you, it's probably every 20 years in reality, or 10 years or 5 years. It's a lifetime besides Formula One. So it's all about reacting. And still, the systems, the systems engineering and the structures within the team, I think are better for me to relate to the structures, because you talk about it looks like a V, what the way you guys work. I've always pushed for the fact that Formula One, because you're having to react so quickly, it's a bit like an inverted V, a very large one, and then underneath that inverted V, you have lots of little ones. So you have somebody that leading the campaign. He doesn't have to be a specialist in anything, but he needs to be a sort of understanding of all, a reasonable understanding of all. And then as you go down through those smaller V's, it's within that big V, you end up with specialists. Like your first two would be your aerodynamics, technical of aerodynamics, head of aerodynamics, and then your head of mechanical design. And below that, then you'd have, below your mechanical design, you'd have suspension design and gearbox design, etc. So you go down through there, and then your last line would be lots and lots of upside down V's. But the end result is that everybody needs to be able to report to somebody else who maybe has just that little bit more of an understanding of each of those areas, until you get right to the point end of that main V, which is, as you say, the technical director. He's the guy that would sort of look closely at what you're spending, well, A, your money on, but B, your man hours on as well, what you need to develop and what you don't need to develop. It doesn't matter whether you've got a problem in the car or not. Everything can be optimized that little bit better. So it's an ongoing situation. You're always trying to optimize things that little bit better. But that ability to get through that sort of minefield of inverted V's means you need to sort of be able to report upwards to the top and make sure that it's being spent wisely, as I say, your manpower and your money. So, if we take a team at the minute, let's say Mercedes, they'll be going back with questions for the aerodynamics department as to the performance advantages they seem to get from that update, because we look at these updates and we classify them as an aerodynamic update. There's no point in Mercedes going back and having a big moan to the guy who does the strategy for the start, because the starts were okay. It's a case of focusing in on what your problem is. Now, the guys that do the software and the strategy for the start line are different people will do the aerodynamic solutions. So the software guys that do the start strategy might come up with a slightly better package, but the pressure's not on them to come up with a slightly better package. The pressure's on the aerodynamic department to come up with a slightly better package. And then the pressure will change a little bit onto the race team, the engineers, to sort out a better setup to optimize the car around that better aerodynamic package. So everything has to work together, but you just move the priorities around depending upon where your problems lie. So I think the system is not very much different. Your sort of systems engineering is not very much different from what you do. You still have to report through to one person who, as I say, leads the ship. But he's not the guy that does it all by any means. There's a huge amount of people underneath him. In Formula One, you're probably talking a technical director now, through those levels of rank, would probably have 250 people working on the performance of the car in various areas. But he can't handle 250 people. So you need to sort of let each group report to their superior, and then that superior reports to another superior, and so on. And as I say, it climbs back up through the field. As it goes down through the field, the V's invert it, as I say, but the technical director's dividing it up. And that's where, all those groups then get allocated the budget or the man hours to try to find solutions to a given problem.
And obviously, one of the big things that's become more and more complex in Formula One in terms of the systems of just making a Formula One car is tracking everything, isn't it? In terms of the timetable for things, that's evolved a lot over time. And I've seen you showed me in the past kind of the spreadsheet you created in terms of speccing out cars.
Yeah.
But these systems have developed enormously now with vast amounts of money invested in them. Spending millions on these sorts of systems that are tracking all the parts, the production schedules, when things have to be done in order for the car to come together. And now these are systems that are integrated across multiple departments, tens of thousands of lines of data in them, constantly being updated in terms of what's going on. So I guess that's sort of a technical area, how that's evolved from kind of where you could do it in your time with a very detailed spreadsheet. Now it's come to the point where they need these huge integrated systems that are enormously complicated.
Yeah, I mean, that's also developed through the years because the companies have got bigger and bigger and bigger, more people, more complication. Everything, ideally, if you're going to run the car on the, let's say the 30th of January next year, your new car, you would assess the amount of time it takes to assemble that car, and you would like everything to arrive in a big pile, let's say on the 25th of January, giving your mechanics time to assemble the car and get to that test on the 30th, because that gives everybody the maximum opportunity to find the best solution for their individual area that's required to make the car as good as possible. But that sort of doesn't happen unless you manage it, to the millisecond as such, because, one little component that just gets delayed because something happens, a pipe bursts in the autoclave or, something stupid happens, could stop the whole car from getting there. So you have to take the longer term things like the gearbox, the chassis, fuel tank, and you sort of get them signed off first, and then the smaller items come later on. The less risk items come later on. So it is about just managing a whole fleet of people. And as you say, the companies have now gone from what we were in our heydays as Jordan, about 150 people, to now 1,000, if not 1,500 people at some of these teams. And managing all of that means you need more management facilities, and that includes, assessing the manufacturing time for every nut and bolt and every little component on the car. There's a huge amount of them. We talk about 4,000 bits, but in reality, it's probably actually getting on 10,000 bits, because if you take all the little body fasteners and every little bit and add it all up, but they've all got to be there before you can build a car. So it takes a lot of management now. It's not a one-man job anymore. It's a huge task.
Yeah, just before we move on to the next question, I'd say that if anybody goes to the United States Grand Prix at COTA in the future, it's well worth dropping on Houston, the Johnson Space Center. You can go and visit the historic mission control room that was referenced in the question, which is a great thing to do. And also, I'm not sure if they still do it. I think it used to alternate. Maybe it still does, but you could also see the sort of modern one, the International Space Station backup mission control, so they can decamp into there to use it. So it's great to see all that stuff. And it's, I've always seen a lot of parallels between kind of Formula One and the space exploration technology.
Well, one of the things the space exploration technology brought to Formula One, was the fact of having this mission control, this group of people sitting in there. And that's happened. Every team now has their mission control back at base. There'll be 20 engineers sitting looking at screens, including just the car going around. They'll have a couple of people watching to see if somebody might have just challenged that white line on the track a little bit, because the stewards don't see every 100% everything. So another couple of eyes looking at it might just detect something, but they'll all be looking at also ride heights and pressures and temperatures and oil pressures, engine pressures, tire temperatures. Every detail on the car will be looked at from mission control, and they'll have an open line to the race team back at the racetrack to sort of say, oh, look, hang on a minute or two, that oil temperature's getting a little bit high, you better ask them to not follow so closely, or the rear tires are getting a little bit hotter, you said a bit easier on the throttle. That doesn't all come from one guy, one engineer on the pit wall. It now comes from a huge group of people. Whereas, again, going back in the years, it was an engineer on the pit wall that was trying to make these decisions. So very different world, but yeah, mission control for NASA and mission control for Formula One is not massively different. It might be a lot more people at one of them. I'm not sure whether it's Formula One or NASA, but there's a lot more people probably. But it's they all follow each other's sort of criteria, requirements. It's all about the same, but optimizing the efficiency of an operation and doing something, whether it be a race meeting or sending somebody to the moon.
Yeah, and the mission controls in F1 work similarly. Everyone's got the lines of communication. Obviously, you have to have the same thing in mission control. In NASA, they can't all talk across each other, so you have your different desks, all with great names like Capcom and Flight and that kind of thing. Ecom, yeah, it's fascinating. Anyway, I won't enthuse about that too much, otherwise I'll start creating an entirely different podcast. But yeah, thanks for the question. The next question comes from Dewey from Wellington in New Zealand. I'm curious as to how cars that fundamentally follow the same ground effect rule set can perform so differently over the curbs and allow some teams to launch over curbs without losing much time and others have to avoid them like the plague. My non-engineering brain would have assumed going over the curbs would release the downforce in the same way that porpoising occurs. Looking forward to being educated.
Well, Dewey, yes. A set of rules dictates a certain criteria for controlling that aerodynamic platform. But I think what you would find is if you could build a Formula One car that didn't create any downforce or aerodynamics, you'd still have cars that could climb the curbs easier than other cars. Because just the fundamentals of the suspension kinematics and the damper arrangements and the rising rate on the rockers or whatever, all the different things that you can build mechanically also compensates for good curb riding or bad curb riding. So the aerodynamics are just on top of it now. So as I say, it's one of those sort of situations where sometimes you need to go back to fundamentals. I think whenever aerodynamics first sort of came into play, really very late 60s, early 70s, people would even run their cars without the downforce on the car, front wings or rear wings, just to get the mechanical setup of the car reasonable and then apply the downforce on top of that. You can't do that now because these cars are generating 4 and 5 times their car weight aerodynamically. It's just such a huge percentage of the performance now. But it still relates to the fact that it's not just the aerodynamics that make the cars better with the curbs, it's how you sort of control your suspension kinematics and the energy that goes into that, and how you attack the curbs. I remember even going back a few years, we turned 2 at Montreal. There was a curb on the inside there, and some of the cars were able to just go over the curb completely. Get their wheels, their inside wheels on the inside of that curb. And I remember our driver saying he can't even touch the curb. And the end result was I showed him a bit of a TV coverage to say, look, the problem is you're trying to ride along the inside part or the outside part of the curb, the track side of the curb, which is angled. It has like a 15-degree slope on it or something. And the minute you hit that, it throws the car across the road. Go on top of the curb, it's flat. And, next session out, it goes on top of the curb. Oh, yeah, curbs are okay now. And it's about, that application about how you attack the curb, one of the things hitting the curb when you're exiting the corner, you'd hurt the traction if it's a rear wheel. You can use the curb to rotate the car to help turn it. So you can use curbs to your advantage as well. And sometimes that's about the driver just applying himself a little bit differently. But as I say, it's not necessarily ground effects that make the curb climbing the critical thing. It's about a lot more stuff, mainly mechanical in there. But you're trying to do that to control the aerodynamics as well. So the two have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, just an example from the recent weekend in Austin when Albon had his spin at turn 19 in sprint qualifying. He said it's because they stiffened up the car a bit before qualifying and he didn't take that into account and just hit the curb in the same way, and that sent him round. Right, the next question comes from Trevor Thompson from Melbourne, Australia. We always hear a lot about balance when it comes to F1 cars. It's the most overloaded term I've come across. It seems to be used for the balance of characteristics between front and rear, aero load, grip, weight, braking, etc. Could you please break down what is meant by balance a bit more and what teams can do to optimise it through design or setup? As an engineer myself, I always enjoy the show.
Yes, Trevor, it is what you say. It's the balance of grip between the front and rear axle. Now, that can be very different. But the one thing you do have is the same front and rear tyre for everybody as far as the contact patch size is concerned, so the rubber on the ground in theory is, the area of rubber on the ground in theory is the same for each team. So balance-wise, you'll take something, and I'm using these percentages just a bit rounded up as such because it's easier that way. You want the mechanical balance, in other words, the center of gravity of the mechanical components to be in a certain position, so that it's using that contact patch properly. So if you were going around just constantly less than 100-kilometer corners, or let's say you went in a skid pad, a big circle, just up to, let's say, 100 kilometers, where aerodynamics are not a huge influence, you'd want the car to be balanced. The problem is the entry of the corner, you're using the front axle to get the car to turn, and you want the rear to react but not step out on you. And then on the exit of the corner, you're using the rear axle more to get the traction and the cornering. So you've got two different things the tyre's doing. Front tyre is braking and turning into the corner. It doesn't like doing two things at once. That's why you see it lock up easily. And the rear tyre is taking a cornering load and a forward load to traction. And it doesn't like doing the two things either. So you have to be very disciplined into when you apply the throttle or when you get off the brakes. But that's the sort of mechanical balance. And then on top of that, you got the aerodynamic balance. So the faster you go, the more downforce you get. But it's the same problem. You've still got to make sure the car will turn into the corner, reacting on the front axle, but you need the rear of the car to be stable, because under braking, if the rear is nervous, it's very easy to lock a rear wheel and the car spin. So aerodynamic balance on top of mechanical balance is very important. And the two of them aren't exactly the same thing. They're nearly the same thing, but they're not quite the same thing. And then again, you got the braking. And the minute you hit the brake pedal, you've got a lot of weight transfer onto the front axle. We used to work out roughly, it's, for the center of gravity height of these cars, you have about 50 kilograms per G. So suddenly hit the brake pedal and the front of the car sees an increase of load of something like 250 kilograms. And that has to come from somewhere, so it comes off the back of the car. And that's why whenever you see the brake balance on the steering wheel, it's not 40% front, it's 50% front, because you need a lot more brakes on the front because you got a lot more load on the front, or you can have a lot more brakes in the front because you got a lot more load on the front. But it's mainly to take load off the rear, or braking off the rear, because you haven't got the load on the rear. So again, it's the mechanical weight transfer and the braking efficiency, and then you got on top of that again the aerodynamics. But the end result of it is that you need to have a balance between front and rear, and you need the driver to understand that there's only certain things you can do. The contact patch and the sort of grip level is a bit like a rugby ball, I suppose, if you sliced it through the middle. But it can take cornering force, but it can't take braking force and cornering force. You go around the outside of that rugby ball, and you'll see that it's you need to be careful how you don't want to step outside of that shape of that rugby ball. You have to keep inside of it, but getting near to that edge of it is very important. And it's the same on the rear. So if you've got the car loaded up laterally and you hit the throttle pedal, the rear will step out on you because it'll just break the lateral traction. So it's, everything's a compromise, but everything's a balance. And you need that balance between the front and rear. And it all starts, as I say, with the tyre contact patch, how big that is. And the more load you put on the car aerodynamically, the bigger that contact patch will get. And that's why the drivers in that complain about the high tyre pressures that Pirelli stipulate, because that reduces the size of the contact patch. Because the harder the more pressure you put into it, it's like a bicycle tyre. It's a lot easier to ride a bicycle if you've got 120 psi in the tyre pressures. But Formula One, it's not like that. We used to run 16, 18 psi in the front tyres, let's say. Now you're running 25, 26 psi in the front tyre. That reduces the contact patch, which is what the driver really wants, or the car really wants, more rubber on the ground.
Yeah, you explained it very well there. Balance is basically everything, isn't it? And it's very much what the driver experiences and how they interpret that, the balance throughout all phases of all the different corners. Right, the final question from Scott Provost from Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm looking forward to the Mexican Grand Prix and its altitude at 2,400 feet above sea level. I'm wondering what considerations are being made. I imagine aerodynamic issues are significant in relation to the density. How is engine output affected? With a normally aspirated engine, the decrease in compression would be significant, but since F1 engines are forced induction and hybrid, would this minimise the loss of power?
Yeah, I'll take the last part first, really, I suppose. How the engine output affected. Obviously, when you had the normally aspirated engines, you lost a lot of power. And there was no way to make up for that. You had to, it's impossible. So now with the turbo, obviously that loss is minimised because the turbo will still, to a certain extent, will increase the boost pressure in the engine. So you won't get the same power, but you'll get close to it, much, much closer than you would with a normally aspirated engine. The thing with that is that you've got to be careful because power makes heat. Heat has to be cooled and the air's thinner, so the cooling is not so good. So you'll see in Mexico, you'll see more cooling on a lot of these cars because, as I say, the air is thinner, so it doesn't cool as well. Same as the brakes. The energy you put into the brake pedal can very, very quickly overheat the brakes. So you need bigger brake backs. It wasn't so bad when you had the normally aspirated engines because you had less power, you'd have less speed. But now you got the same speed, more or less because the power output's the same. The electrical power output's the same being hybrid. So the total power output is knocking on the door of being exactly the same. But so the cars will go faster. They'll go faster even with a higher downforce wing assembly on it. If you take the wing assembly that you'd run in Montreal against the wing assembly you'll run in Mexico, it probably very similar top speed, but the wing assembly you run in Mexico will be huge besides what you run in Montreal. So it's a compromise of everything. But the big problem you have in Mexico, or the main problem you have in Mexico, whenever you've got a turbocharged engine, and electrical power, is the fact that the cars will need more cooling because of the thin air. They'll need more cooling for the brakes because of the thin air and the fact the speed's up there. So it's, again, it's a big compromise for everybody. It definitely is a thing. They will have less grip for a given car speed because the air is thinner, the downforce isn't there, even though they are running a larger rear wing assembly than what they would like to run for that type of speed circuit.
Yeah, it's such a unique venue because of that, in that you're running high downforce configuration but with low downforce. So hard work for the drivers, and in fact, it's having the less dense air makes life difficult for them as well. They don't have a huge amount of acclimatization time, and even if you charge up a flight of stairs, you feel it a little bit just being an unfit journalist, and drivers will feel it as well.
Yeah, the thing is, Ed, you got to relate that to the pay packet on a Friday night. I think the drivers get paid, handsomely, or the majority of the drivers get paid handsomely for their efforts. But yes, it is a tricky thing. It's Formula One. The cars are hard to drive. They're not easy to drive. Yes, they got power steering and they got everything's great and they're very comfortable inside of there. But it's still warm. It's still hot inside of there. So it's one of those sort of situations where the fit drivers are the drivers that are physically very fit, very efficient in their muscle mass, but also having a mental capacity left over to think about it all and make sure they don't waste that muscle efficiency, because it's so easy to waste that, so easy to throw away some of it just because you can't think about where you are and what you're doing and breathing properly and, just not exerting that wasted energy. Exert the energy you need, but don't exert wasted energy.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be the watchword for all the drivers this weekend. Well, thanks very much to everyone who sent questions in. If you've got a question for us to answer in a future episode, send it to podcasts@therace.com. You can either email it written in or record it as a voice note if you prefer. Well, the races are coming thick and fast. The next time we'll be back will be after the Brazilian Grand Prix, which is the third race of this triple header. So join us then for more from Gary.
The Athletic.